The events of Starfield are set 207 years into the future, in the year 2230, but its story begins long before then. Humanity's first shot into the cosmos came out of the spasms of a dying Reich. In the summer of 1944, just 1 year prior to the fall of Berlin, German scientists successfully launched a V-2 rocket into the stars. The object's time in space was brief and nominal. It barely broke the designated boundary and afterwards simply plummeted back down to the Earth's surface. But it would help ignite a new age of exploration. The V-2 rocket itself was never even necessarily designed with the cosmos in mind. Instead, it served as a uniquely powerful propulsion engine that its creators hoped would be able to rain fire on Allied cities while avoiding anti-air systems. The Germans simply wanted to test its hypothetical limits. In the aftermath of their nation's defeat, many of the V-2 scientists continued their work under new American and Soviet masters, as both victors sought to leverage this new technology against each other in an emerging new conflict. The United States and USSR soon found creative uses for the ashes of the V-2 program. In 1957, the Reds successfully placed the world's first satellite into orbit, the Sputnik 1. 4 years later, Yuri Gagarin would become the first man to have ever entered space, on the Soviet craft Vostok 1. Not to be outdone, in the late 1960s, 2 decades of American persistence culminated in the landing of the Apollo 11 astronauts on the lunar surface, marking the first time humans would set foot on an interplanetary body, and a giant leap for mankind. Over the ensuing century, mankind's affair with On High would persist, as military planners and private interests began to recognize new opportunities. Satellite launches accelerated dramatically. Telescopes and radios were sent into the infinite abyss as scientists and the public eagerly searched for what could be out there. By the 2000s, the governments of old were flirting with the Red Planet, sending an assortment of orbital satellites and even rovers to Mars, and humanity patiently awaited its next great Apollo moment. That moment would finally come in the year 2050, when humans finally reached the next frontier and set foot on its barren surface. Beginning in the 2090s, the governments and companies of old Earth began establishing permanent research outposts on the lunar and Martian surfaces, representing mankind's foray into interplanetary colonization. In the ensuing decades, various advancements in this field were made at increasingly exponential rates. NASA and its international peers found themselves in a newly invigorated space race, as the powers of Earth all began a jockey to see who could colonize the celestial bodies the fastest and reap the greatest benefits. The result was a renaissance for astronomical engineering and spaceflight. Increasingly sophisticated new materials, structures, suits, and spacecraft all accelerated the conquest of these brave new worlds, as small research outposts gave way to established settlements, mines, and military bases across Luna and the Martian surface. The pinnacle of these new innovations was the gravity drive. In the mid-2100s, NASA scientists created a device capable of folding gravity and space, which could then in turn be used to propel a spacecraft across trillions of miles in the span of mere seconds. In the first successful test flight, Jupiter, a planet that, under normal circumstances, required several years to meet from Earth, and thus had evaded man's efforts, was reached in just a few moments. Consequently, humanity's foray into the cosmos accelerated tenfold. Within years, mankind had spread across the solar system, and small expeditionary teams had even begun establishing a presence on Alpha Centauri, the nearest star to our solar system. But just as man grew increasingly obsessed with conquering new frontiers, his old began to falter. In the 2150s, American scientists came to an alarming conclusion. Earth's magnetosphere was slipping. The magnetosphere, a magnetic field that surrounds Earth, keeping the atmosphere intact and protecting the planet from extraordinary solar radiation rays, was beginning to fade. The reasons why were hotly debated, but the ultimate conclusion of the academic community was that the planet had roughly 50 good years left, until the magnetosphere was finally gone and the atmosphere slipped off with it. The planet would be rendered uninhabitable by solar radiation by the year 2200. It was already too late to save Earth. The damage was done and irreversible. However, these 5 decades provided enough time for something else. An exodus. With the fate of their home sealed, the human race looked to the stars for salvation. In 2159, an anxious but confident international community came together to form the United Colonies, a sovereign international body politic with one mission: to get the Earthlings off Earth in time. Within a year of its inauguration, the United Colonies sent out their first major colonial passenger ship, the Galileo, to the planet Jemison in the Alpha Centauri system. These settlers would found New Atlantis, the first proper city outside of the solar system, and soon the capital of the United Colonies. While recent innovations had made even the most hostile planets amendable to human life, the UC emphasized their resettlement efforts to target the few planets across the Milky Way with Earth-like conditions, making places like Jemison the primary destination of man. Though, as the human exodus persisted, the United Colonies administration came to the conclusion that they alone could not manage the entire evacuation. To create an incentive for private interests to settle the stars and thus relieve their own burdens, in 2161, the United Colonies issued the Centaurus Proclamation, a document guaranteeing the right of any man to colonize any celestial body in the Milky Way, and for these colonists to form their own sovereign governments and militaries in the process, free of any UC taxes or regulations. The plan worked. Human settlement of the Milky Way continued to grow exponentially, and within a few decades, most of the peoples of Earth had successfully made it to their new homes in the cosmos. One of the earliest pioneers of this era was Solomon Coe, an astrophysicist originally from Wyoming, whom, after learning of the Centaurus Proclamation, gathered a number of comrades and set out to settle a distant star system, which they named Cheyenne, after Coe's hometown. Here, on the planet Aquila, Solomon and his followers would lay the foundations for the great city now known as Aquila City, one which would soon grow to rival the economic and cultural significance of the UC's own capital, back on Jemison. Over the next few decades, man would continue his buzz throughout the stars in relative peace and tranquility. New systems were colonized, new cities founded, and all kinds of primitive extraterrestrial life were domesticated to further bend the Milky Way to his image. Alien life indeed proved to be plentiful and diverse across the galaxy. All sorts of rodents, pests, megafauna, and potential beasts of burden were documented, cataloged, and studied, as humanity raced to make sense of the new worlds it conquered. Alas, as the Exodus came to its conclusion, the seeds that would end this peaceful new age of exploration were sown in the year 2188, when the citizens of the Cheyenne system united with those of Volii and the great pleasure city of Neon to form a new galactic power, the Freestar Collective. While the UC's Centaurus Proclamation filled the Milky Way with an assortment of varied minor, independent star systems, the Freestar Collective would represent the first major government and military power capable of rivaling the United Colonies' own. The UC's government soon found itself questioning whether allowing sovereign states to take control of entire systems was such a good idea, after all. Within a decade of the Freestar Collective's inception, it would find itself jockeying with the United Colonies in the galaxy's first true war. In 2194, the United Colonies began sending space stations, which they claimed were medical vessels, into the neutral Narion star system, Those living around Narion feared an imminent sunset to their century of independence, and rapidly agreed to annexation by the Freestar Collective, deeming Freestar the more benevolent potential master. Following Narion's annexation, Freestar demanded the United Colonies withdraw all assets from the system. The colonies refused, and thus the fuse was lit that would soon spark the galaxy's first interplanetary war. Both sides rapidly began mobilization, aggressively posturing their fleets and armies against each other until the first shots were fired. For the next 20 years, mankind would be locked in the most brutal struggle since the World Wars. In the end, the United Colonies would secure victory, destroying the Freestar fleet outright, and the Treaty of Narion was signed in 2216. In the document, both powers agreed to limit their expansion to no more than 3 star systems each, and a series of new limitations were introduced on the scale of each nation's navy, all in the vain interest of preventing such a conflict from ever emerging again. Despite its success, the United Colonies would end up allowing Narion to join the Freestar Collective anyway, in exchange for some unspecified concessions. As the ink of the Narion Treaty dried, a new power would enter the galactic stage: House Va'ruun, a cult of religious fanatics dedicated to the worship of their mysterious god, the Great Serpent, whom they seek to impose on the settled systems by any means necessary. House Va'ruun's origins actually warrant a brief mention, as it's one of the strangest stories in the galaxy. In the year 2194, one of the final colony ships to leave Earth amidst its exodus mysteriously vanished shortly after exiting the solar system. While by this point, mankind was no stranger to interstellar disasters. Ships failed, crashed, and were attacked all the time. This one was different. The vessels simply slipped away from contact one day without a trace. A search effort returned no sign of the craft's fate, and its transponders were inactive. Had it experienced an equipment failure or suffered an ambush, as many other vessels did, it would have left obvious debris or attempted to reach out. There would have been signs of other craft in the vicinity, but this one just vanished. It wouldn't be until the year 2230, a decade and a half after the Narion War, that something resembling closure would be given to the galaxy. 40 years after its disappearance, the colony ship returned, now under the leadership of a man named Janan Va'ruun, hence the name. The miraculously reappeared survivors returned different, however. They began preaching of a mysterious, supernatural entity which they called the Great Serpent, and begging any who would listen to embrace its name. House Va'ruun's slithering numbers would grow slowly over the next few years, as thousands of people found meaning and inspiration in the snake's venomous embrace. Despite initially making rather peaceful overtures upon their emergence, within 10 years, by 2240, the followers of the Great Serpent declared a crusade against the non-believers of the settled systems, and began wreaking havoc across the Milky Way. Still licking their wounds from the Narion War and somewhat crippled by their self-imposed limitations, the United Colonies and Freestar Collective were slow to respond, and found themselves barely able to protect their own capitals, let alone all the settled systems. Chaos would reign for the next 20 years, until the anemic galactic governments were able to mount a more fierce resistance, and Janan Va'ruun, the church's leader, suddenly passed away. In the wake of his death, and facing an increasingly more formidable opponent, the followers of the Great Serpent finally sued for peace, and the shell-shocked systems were able to breathe something resembling a sigh of relief. Va'ruun would cease its aggressive actions and even establish an embassy in New Atlantis, in the hopes that they could once again grow their congregation peacefully. Alas, the previous 20 years had rendered the people of the galaxy a bit less receptive to their message than before. Even as the faction officially attempted to settle down and moderate, various splinter groups and zealots refused to lay down their arms, declaring any peace with non-believers illegitimate and continuing their struggle. To this day, renegade Varun forces, officially denounced by their leadership, continue to harass the stars. And they're not alone. During the chaos of the Serpent's Crusade, while the colonies were distracted, a prison riot on the planet Suvorov turned into a full-fledged mass breakout, and the inmates were even able to secure control of a large UC fleet guarding their planet. The escaped convicts named their new armada the Crimson Fleet, and like House Varun splinter groups, the Crimson Fleet continues pillaging the undefended corners of the Milky Way, even up to the present. As if the first half of the 2200s hadn't proved destructive enough, around 2250, the last major threat of the century presented itself. Mysterious, eldritch creatures, now known as terrormorphs, began appearing at various human outposts and settlements across the Milky Way, and hunting the locals. These grotesque creatures had no clear homeworld or means of transportation. They just suddenly started showing up and began preying on men, women, children, and their livestock. While their exact origin remains unknown, it was eventually discovered that terrormorphs tend to follow humans roughly 80 years after a habitable world has been colonized, allowing some degree of predictability in their movement patterns, but providing little respite for the weary denizens of the early settled worlds. 2275 would prove to be the next landmark year, as Sebastian Banks, an accomplished scientist and ship captain, would found a new organization of explorers and researchers, calling it Constellation, on the planet Jemison, and opening up the lodge which remains in operation to this day. Constellation is dedicated to the investigation and exploration of the universe's unanswered questions. They seek to map uncharted corners of space and identify the origins of reality itself. Poetically, just a couple of decades after founding Constellation, Sebastian Banks himself would become a mystery, as he disappeared while on a grand voyage to an unexplored region of the Milky Way. He would never be heard from again. By 2090, Earth's sterilization was complete, and desolate sands blanketed the once vibrant cities and forests of old Earth. Humanity's home was finally gone for good, but humanity would live on. The next 18 years would be quiet in the Milky Way, as the colonies in Freestar recovered and then some from the devastation of prior decades, and various enterprising pioneers continued to explore and settle on the expanding frontiers of the Milky Way in a new form of manifest destiny. However, this cosmic concert of powers grew increasingly restless. By the early 2300s, the Freestar Collective began operations on the lunar star system, in hopes of feeding their ever-growing population with agricultural products. The United Colonies demanded these operations be ceased, considering them to be in violation of the Narion Treaty, which specified limits on expansion. Freestar refused, fleets were mobilized, and once again, the Milky Way was sucked back into the chaos which it so recently escaped. The colonies expected a swift repeat of their previous victory, but their power had waned since the last Great War, while Freestar's only grew. Adding to their misfortunes, in 2308, Londinion, perhaps the colony's second largest city located in the Toliman system, was suddenly overrun by a great horde of terrormorphs. While terrormorphs had always been a problem in Toliman and across all their systems, the onslaught that attacked Londinion was unlike any ever before seen. In the end, UC Grand Admiral Francois Sanon ordered Londinian spaceport bombed to prevent an evacuation that could spread the infestation. The decision may have saved the rest of the system, but it doomed those still in the city. The disaster at Londinion would mark one of the single greatest tragedies the human race had seen. 3 years later, in 2311, Admiral Sinan led an armada to storm the Freestar capital of Cheyenne, in what he hoped would be one final push against the enemy. He was right, though more in a Croesus way than anything. The Grand UC fleet found itself bogged down and picked apart by an onslaught of inferior collective Navy ships and even civilian vessels, as thousands of Cheyenne civilians joined the fight to defend their homes. Sinan would be forced to order a retreat of his shattered forces. With their navy in shambles, the colonies sued for peace, and Freestar had finally avenged the defeat it suffered in the previous century. The terms of the ensuing treaty, dubbed the Armistice, were far harsher than those of Narion. The UC would be forced to submit its leading generals, including Sinan, to a Freestar tribunal, and agree to strict force limitations while accepting the Collective's maneuvers in Vestra. Francois and many of his co-admirals would ultimately be sentenced to pay the ultimate price. Ironically, House Varun found itself a major player in the peace, as they functioned as a neutral third party that mediated between the powers and eventually even earned a spot as one of the armistice's guarantors. Strangely, sometime after negotiating the treaty, House Varun vanished, abandoning their embassy in New Atlantis and seemingly retreating to a yet unknown part of the galaxy. The reason for such behavior has eluded the brightest minds in celestial politics, but the governments remain anxious that when Varun returns, they may bring a second crusade. In 2226, Barrett, Constellation's most enigmatic Rizzler, would have a supernatural experience when handling an artifact he dug up in the Guild's archives. And this would ignite a frenzious investigation within the faction, as Constellation raced to discover the meaning. And just 4 years later, in 2230, a nameless miner on the planet Vectera would encounter a similar artifact and suffer the same visions. Thus, we arrive in the present day. The Milky Way is rocked by menacing monsters, pirates, and religious fanatics, while the great powers maintain an uneasy peace. Mankind's presence in the stars continues to grow, and our perception of reality has been shaken by the recent emergence of strange celestial artifacts. Thus, the stage is set for the events of Starfield. Will you rise to the occasion and make order out of the chaos? Or will you find yourself tempted by it, immersing yourself with the nefarious characters of the galaxy? Will you get to the bottom of Constellation's great mystery, or try to play Kingmaker in a galactic jockey for power? Whatever the case, those decisions are between you and Todd Howard. Thanks for watching.